We were in the original House of Representatives chamber at the old State House, which was the Arkansas State Capitol from 1836 to 1911. And the secession convention was held in this room in 1861. And really one of the most dramatic moments of the early part of the war in Arkansas happened here when it came down to only one delegate, a man named Isaac Murphy from North Arkansas, had refused to vote in favor of secession. The chairman of the convention, asked him to change his vote, and Murphy refused to do so. After which, a woman named Martha Trapnell, who was in the balcony right behind us, threw a bouquet of flowers at his feet in recognition of his principled stand. Later in the war, of course, this was the Confederate capital until Little Rock was taken on September 10 of 1863. And after that, this was the seat of Unionist government for Arkansas, and at which time Isaac Murphy became the governor.
Tell us about this book. What's different about the Arkansas experience in the Civil War compared to the story that most people know about South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia?
Okay. Well, Arkansas, first and foremost, is a frontier state. When you left Arkansas, you were in a foreign country in some cases, and moving over to the Indian Territory. We had a relatively small population at the start of the war, 25% of which was enslaved. And when the war started, Arkansas, I think the folks on the east side of the river for the Confederacy saw Arkansas as more as a source of manpower than anything else. Though during '62, the Confederacy did attempt to use Arkansas as a springboard for invasion of Missouri. The two great battles of '62 were at Poison. The two great battles of '62 were at Pea Ridge and at Prairie Grove in northwest Arkansas. That effectively ended Arkansas's role as an invasion to attack Missouri. We had in this state more than 770 offensive operations during the course of the war. Only Virginia, Tennessee, and Missouri saw more military activity than happened here in this state, which is something that a lot of people don't realize. And in Arkansas, we didn't have as many set-piece battles as you did with the larger armies on the other side of the river. There were fewer troops involved, but the fighting was every bit as intense as in other theaters. And we had Arkansas, Missouri, and the Indian Territory probably had the most vicious irregular warfare that was seen anywhere in the United States and Confederate States during the Civil War.
How so? Explain that.
Well, in Arkansas, especially after 1863, north of the river was virtual no man's land. There were Union patrols, occasional Union posts at places like Fayetteville, but the countryside belonged to the bushwhackers, and some of these were irregular troops, but a lot of them were just lawless bands of thieves and murderers who just acted with impunity. The civilian population in that part of the state just lived in a constant state of terror.
As we look at the chapters, and you've talked a little bit about that vote for secession or not, characterize Arkansas at this time in terms of Union loyalties, Southern loyalties at the beginning of the war.
Okay. Well, at the beginning of the war, you could kind of generalize by saying that the eastern and southern parts of the state, which was where the larger plantations were located, were in favor of secession, while the uplands, the mountainous regions, were not as much so. When the secession convention was announced, the delegates that were sent, the majority of the delegates were actually pro-union in their sympathies, and the initial convention recessed without coming to a conclusion. Without voting for secession, they voted to come back come back in, I believe, in August of '61, unless something came up in the meantime. Well, Fort Sumter happened in the meantime, which led them to come back, and ultimately the issue for a lot of them was coercion. If the North was going to try to coerce the seceded states back into the Union, then Arkansas would not support that, and that's what happened.
You hear lots of stories about brother fighting brother, you know, in the Civil War. Were there instances you found where families were on both sides of this conflict?
There were numerous instances of that, particularly in some of the northern counties where, you know, there were Confederate units raised, but there were a lot of Unionist units raised as well. And in fact, Arkansas had more men fighting for the Union than any other seceded state, with the exception of Tennessee. But I guess you'd classify it as a skirmish, but in 1864, at a little place called Lunenburg up in the mountains of Izard County, a smaller Union force attacked a larger Confederate force. And what really makes this incident stand out is that just about every man in both sides was from Izard County.
Oh, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a little footnote, but really, you know, kind of hits the heart of what the war in Arkansas was about.
What role did the Arkansas River play? Is there anything to the geography of the area that played into how the battle and the Civil War played out there?
Yes, well, the Arkansas River was in many ways the breadbasket for the region. The agricultural output of the counties bordering the river was huge. And it also was a means of getting from the best means of getting from the Mississippi River to the interlands, into the Indian Territory. The Arkansas was not a especially beloved river for steamboat captains. It tended to suddenly run dry, and a lot of times boats would be trapped in pools between sandbars until a freshet would come through and they'd be able to run a little further up the river. But ultimately you could get to the you know, as far as Fort Gibson on the river. Now it was also seen by the Union, I think, as the best means of taking Little Rock. And Little Rock was very important symbolically as a Confederate state capital. Lincoln wanted to bring as many of those capitals back into the Union as possible. So in 1863, that became a war goal, and after Vicksburg fell, the manpower became available to make that happen.
In the Civil War, you always hear stories of spies or generals. The people really make this war come alive to a lot of folks. Did you find that in researching your book? Are there characters in there that you think folks ought to know about?
Yes, definitely. And one thing with this book, I tried in every instant possible to tell the stories through the words of the soldiers themselves. I use a lot of first-person accounts and things like that. And there are some larger-than-life characters like General James Blunt for the Union, who was pugnacious to a fault, I guess you could say. He didn't always look before he leapt, but he would, you know, he was a hard-fighting general, and he tended to win his battles. On the Confederate side, you had Joe Shelby, cavalryman out of Missouri, who pound for pound, I think, was one of the top three cavalry officers that fought for the Confederacy anywhere in the country. And he did he saw a lot of activity during 1863, and then in the following year, Shelby actually worked in cooperation with the Union commander of the garrison at Batesville in northern Arkansas. They worked together to eliminate the bushwhacker menace. They both put out proclamations saying, you know, you must join one army or the other by such and such a date, and if you don't, we'll kill you. and basically that's what happened. They went out and they hunted down these bands of thieves, and you know, if they didn't enlist, they were put to the sword. The
Emancipation comes in January of 1863, I believe. What effect did that have in Arkansas?
The Emancipation was it was interesting in writing this book, particularly in that I focused on '63. So I started with the 1st of January, and and gathered some of the opinions of the soldiers about this. You know, of course, the southern side had their views, but on the northern side there was a lot of dissent about it. A lot of the soldiers, a lot of the Union soldiers, wrote home. One guy said, "Well, I didn't join the army to become a slave stealer and a house burner," and some of the Confederates reported hundreds of Union soldiers deserting because they did not want to. They didn't want to fight now that it had become a question of slavery. Though for others, for other Yankee soldiers, it suddenly became, this is the cause that I really wanted to fight for, and it just had a great effect on the morale of the soldiers there initially. Mm-hmm. Now it had a huge effect as far as manpower was concerned. I believe it was in May of '63. Lorenzo Thomas, the Adjutant General of the United States Army, came to Helena. At that point, Helena was the only Union base of any size in Arkansas, and it was surrounded by contraband camps. Thousands and thousands of African American slaves fled their plantations and went to the army in hopes of freedom. Well, when Thomas came down, his task was to take some of these men and make them into soldiers. So he held a meeting. It was like a tent revival meeting. He's up there, and governor and the congressmen are all speechifying and all like that. And the next morning, the entire 1st Arkansas Infantry of African descent was recruited. White soldiers were selected as officers, and a lot of men took advantage of that, in that they could go from being a private to being a captain, with the stroke of a pen. And this provided a lot of much-needed manpower in Arkansas, as well as as for the entire Union Army. But in this state, a total of 5,526 black men were recruited into the units that were raised in this state. With the fall of Vicksburg, that freed up a lot of soldiers to for other operations. So at that point, the Federal High Command decided it was time to go ahead and move against Little Rock. So several troops came over from Vicksburg to Helena, and operations began to take Little Rock. There were 6,000 cavalry out of southeast Arkansas that came down Crowley's Ridge, and 6,000 infantry from Helena that marched cross country. They met at Clarendon and then continued on from there. But the majority of the fighting in this campaign was done by the cavalry on both sides, really by necessity for the Confederates, because their infantry was so torn up at Helena, and there were so many desertions after that they just were barely even a factor in the Little Rock campaign. John Wynne Davidson was the commander of the Union cavalry, and he was a Virginian who remained loyal to the Union after secession. He was West Pointer, and he brought regular Army discipline to his volunteer soldiers. So he was not very popular at the start of this campaign. In fact, one boy from Missouri wrote to his father, said that, yeah, several of the men are planning to kill General Davidson, in which measure I hope they're successful. But Davidson, they started marching cross country. They had a skirmish at a place called Brownsville, east of Little Rock, on the 25th of August, 1863, which was the first real opposition of any note that they faced. And then 2 days later, on the 27th, They fought the Confederates at Bayou Mito, which is at what is now the town of Jacksonville. Day-long fight there resulted in the Union being forced back to Brownsville, and Frederick Steele, the Federal commander at that point, just kind of sat back and started probing around, figuring the best ways to attack Little Rock with the least amount of damage to his troops. Now,
by that time, they're getting pretty close to Little Rock, because
right, they're about 30, 40 miles away at that point. The Confederates are primarily fortifying the high ground on the north side of the Arkansas River. Sterling Price, who was in command at that point, was hoping that the Yankees would be as obliging about dashing themselves against impregnable fortifications as he had been at Helena, but Steele was a far more clever general than that. But between the battle at Bayou Mito and the fall of Little Rock, the two principal Confederate cavalry commanders, Marsh Walker and John Marmaduke. Marmaduke was angry at Walker at Helena. He didn't feel that Walker had supported him in his attack on one of the batteries there. At Brownsville, the plan had been for Marmaduke to lead the Union troops into an ambush by Walker's men. Walker did not follow through there. And then at Bayou Mito, Walker refused several requests from Marmaduke to come up to the firing line from his headquarters in the rear. Well, the two generals' staffs started sending notes back and forth. You know, Walker saying, "Now, were you calling me a coward?" And no, I wasn't calling you a coward. I just didn't want to serve under you. You know, it escalated to the point that finally one of Walker's aides sent a note saying, "Well, General Walker demands the satisfaction that is due him as a gentleman." So on the 6th of September, the morning of September 6, 1863, these two Confederate generals, both West Pointers, met in a field north of Little Rock, fought a duel. Marmaduke fatally wounded Marsh Walker. And all of this, 4 days before Little Rock fell, while the Hun is at the door, these guys are fighting a duel
amongst themselves.
So it was just, it was just a crazy time. On the 10th, Steele had decided his best route to attack Little Rock. So his plan was to get his cavalry onto the south side of the river, march his infantry along the north side to confront the earthworks, but try and flank them out with the cavalry. On the morning of the 10th, his pioneer troops went out and started building a pontoon bridge across the Arkansas at a horseshoe loop in the river, where they could set up their cannon to oppose anybody who went against them. Well, a Confederate battery did come out the next morning and fire a few shots, and they just got hammered by the Feds, so they had to pull across. So Steele's cavalry crosses at this horseshoe bend and moves toward Little Rock on the south side of the river. The Confederates confront them at Bayou Fourche. It's almost two battles in one, but they're steadily driven back. Price looks at the situation and, saying that he didn't want to be caught in a trap like Pemberton had been at Vicksburg, he orders his troops to abandon their fortifications on the north side of the river, and they retreat to the southwest. And that at 5:30 that afternoon, the mayor of Little Rock formally surrendered Little Rock to the Union, and Little Rock would be a Union town for the remainder of the war.